has been stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch on vacation, make you crazy.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of TRD Talks Live. I'm Eric Enquist, Senior Managing Editor at The Real Deal, and I'll be your host for today. I'm happy to be joined by the presidents of three of the largest business improvement districts in New York City. They are Barbara Askins of the 125th Street BID, Jessica Lappin of the Downtown Alliance, and Dan Biederman of the 34th Street Partnership. Welcome to everybody. Before we get started, I just want to remind our viewers that we do bring these TRD Talks Live to you for free, but we depend on subscribers. So please go to therealdeal.com to subscribe to all your favorite real estate and political news, therealdeal.com. So welcome everyone. So I want to start with the obvious, which is you guys run three of the largest business improvement districts in Manhattan. And Manhattan's under a tremendous amount of pressure these days. But to give, I'm afraid some of our viewers probably don't realize exactly what a bid is. So I want to start with Dan, because you were probably one of the most essential people in creating bids in the first place. So could you very briefly tell us the story of how you started the bid around Bryant Park back in late 70s, early 80s?
Yes, and Eric, the simple story was government had not been able to perform many of the things the private sector, realty owners particularly, wanted performed. Bryant Park was 84, Grand Central was 88, and 34th Street was 92. Some examples, Midtown Manhattan was ankle deep in litter by the time people went home from work. The reason was hand litter collection went out in about 1955 or 60. So sweeping the streets was not done until 2 in the morning by machines. So just an example of things government had opted out of doing, and what you now see all over the place, which is people with pails, shovels, and brooms.
So Bryant Park at the time was kind of a mess, and you sort of organized the owners, the property owners around there, to take care of it. How did you put that together?
Well, Bryant Park, the BID, is only a small piece of the privatization, really. But at Grand Central and 34th Street, we put the owners together into a group that was paying initially roughly 15 cents a square foot for services like sanitation, as I mentioned. Streetscape was a disaster. So was security. There was nobody to help the police with eyes and ears. Crime was much higher than it is today. And streets were gray as can be, no horticulture. So Eric, just 4 examples of services that were paid for by the private sector on top of what the city was doing, which was not much during the 70s and 80s.
All right, so Barbara, so can you explain how bids are funded, where your funding comes from, and who's represented on a bid board?
Sure. Bids are funded through an assessment. Our assessment uses square footage as well as frontage, basically because we have larger properties that are on the side streets and they have larger frontage on the side streets. So to make it fair, we included both front footage and the assessed value, and that makes the larger owners pay more. But on our bid boards, by law, you must have property owners, commercial tenants, residential tenants, and 4 representatives of the elected officials, which is the mayor, the controller, the city council person, and the borough president. And then by law also, even though they're non-voting, the community boards must be there. And so we cross 3 community boards, so we have 9, 10, and 11. And so even though they have no vote, they have a lot of influence. It influences, a lot of our decisions. But then you have the non-voting category, and we use that to bring in people who may not necessarily be in the bid boundaries, but are critical to our operations, like a Con Edison. Those type people. We bring in Columbia University in the non-voting category. And so we were formed in 1993, and bringing together all of those owners and all of those people, as well as the community, because then you have to go through what is typically like a ULERT process and get approval from the community boards or whatever. And we went through with 100% approval through the whole process.
Right. So essentially, I think the big difference between bids and, say, merchants associations is that you are pretty much guaranteed funding because the assessment is on top of your property taxes for the property owners in there, in the area. So, you know, that's a steady stream of money. You don't have to go knocking on doors and collecting dues like a trade group might have to do around this time. Jessica, could you tell us, you have one of the largest bids. I think all three of your bids, you probably have budgets in many millions of dollars. And I think 17 million was the last budget I think I saw for the Downtown Alliance. But the average bid is probably around 2 million or so. But can you tell me how that works in terms of, you know, how you take that revenue and what you do with it?
Sure. So, and we're now about 24 million, give or take, a mix of assessment revenue, as you mentioned, and then we have some contractual revenue as well. And there are some bids that do some private fundraising on the side. We don't do a ton of that. Although for certain grant programs, we just did a small business grant program in the COVID era to try and help some of our small mom and pop shops, and that was funded mostly from private contributions. But I would say our budget, the way it breaks down, is 60% of it goes towards what we call our core services. You know, as Dan mentioned, the men and women out there emptying garbage cans, emptying recycling cans, removing graffiti, maintaining our parks. Things that I think sometimes people assume that the city does, but the city doesn't do. And I think, unfortunately, in this cycle that we're headed into now and the fiscal realities we're facing, probably the city will be doing even less of some of those services.
I was going to ask you if that's an argument for bids, you know, because normally the argument against bids is like, why should I pay for something that the city should be doing? But what you're telling me is the city just doesn't do it.
I mean, you know, they don't for the most part, and I don't know if it's because they know that we can, but I think, you know, look, I would expect that in the coming years, the Parks Department is going to have a fraction of the budget that it had, and so we're already maintaining the parks downtown, and I think we'll be called on to do more. We do homeless outreach. We have a contract with BRC, the Bowery Residents Committee. You know, now the NYPD is not enforcing homelessness. Lots of things are changing very quickly. They won't be enforcing vendor regulations. So, you know, I think it's 100% an argument for why we're important, and we're going to become even more important.
Have any of you had to pare back at all during the pandemic? Because obviously a lot of trade groups, private companies, government, I mean, everyone seems to be paring back, but I'm guessing you haven't yet because, again, you're funded through this property tax assessment.
Well,
Yet, and I've had many conversations with my board, particularly my executive board, about this, and they felt that we could not pare back, particularly with the sanitation and public safety. Even though they didn't have many people on the streets, having the bids, eyes and ears out there, and also keeping the cleaning was something they saw as essential. And also they didn't want to cut the promotion budget because they felt we would need it for whenever we came back. So we have not seen that yet.
And Dan, what's your situation, your financial situation?
34th Street's just had to nip and tuck a little bit because it's mainly assessment based, and the owners, I think, are going to pay the assessments. Bryant Park has very little of its money from assessments. It's almost entirely earned income generated inside the park. That's threatened. Restaurants were closed, kiosks are doing a fraction of what they did. We're worried about our Winter Village activity, which is quite profitable. So Bryant Park has had to pare back programming quite a bit, Eric.
How many stores are boarded up in your three districts? I'm going to start with you, Dan, because you know you had probably the most infamous looting incident with Macy's on Herald Square. But what is your district looking like now? Are there still plywood covering your storefronts?
3/4 of the plywood is gone, much as the situation is with Fifth Avenue from 59th to 34th. But there is still some plywood up. And my big concern, it took me 2 decades to get owners to take away what we call solid gates, which get graffiti put on them. We have to remove them. They're very ugly, even if there is no graffiti on them. They stop light from penetrating to the street. The owners' offerings can't be viewed. We're quite worried that some of the owners and tenants will put solid gates back in once the plywood goes down.
Well, they can't do that, Dan. They can't. It's against the law.
2026 is when that law goes into effect, Eric. So we're hoping they obey the law prospectively.
I didn't realize that. That was now, Jessica. You were in the city council for a bunch of years, but I think maybe that law even predated you. The roll down gate law.
Boy, I don't know. I've been gone long enough. It's hard to remember.
This is one of those things where the council didn't force anyone to take a gate away, but they said if you were going to replace a gate, it had to be with a see-through gate rather than roll down. But I would like to know, like, you all have security, right? It's not just sanitation. You have security people in your bids. So why was there any looting? Dan, I mean, you don't have the kind of force that could respond to that kind of thing?
That night, June 1st, so many things went wrong before in Soho, and that night in Midtown in general, not just 34th Street. The police department had huge forces out, but it was half what they needed. So our security could have had very little impact. It was organized looting. It was in the wake of the demonstrations, not really organized at all by the demonstrators. And it was clever. It was breaking a window, then having a team come in and loot the store, then having them call for backup with cars that would come take the loot away. So this was it was organized crime essentially that night. And the police couldn't keep up with it. So obviously we couldn't either.
And Barbara or Jessica, what happened in your districts?
I mean, I think we were, obviously there were many protests that came through Lower Manhattan, and they were mostly peaceful. I mean, we did have some looting at a few locations, but by and large, I would say, compared to Soho, NoHo, other places in Midtown, we were really spared from that, and the protesters were pretty peaceful. So I think it was heartbreaking. We had asked people at the beginning of this not to board up because of the message that it sent, and then of course they had no choice. And so that was tough. And I think for all of us, there's been a lot of conditions are constantly changing. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Do what we can, undo what we just did, wait to do it again. And I think it's very helpful for us to have our public safety people out on the street to be the eyes and ears, but they're not cops. They're not trained to be. They are not. They're not really capable in this kind of an instance, as Dan was describing, where you're dealing with real organized crime and large crowds. I mean, that's not what they're there for.
Barbara, what's Harlem looking like these days?
Well, we're actually looking pretty good. We didn't get the looting and we didn't get the damage, and I attribute that to the fact that we function as a community, even though we're a business improvement district. There are so many social issues that Harlem has dealt with over the years that it takes a community to deal with it. So when the protesters came, it was immediately recognized that these were people from out of town or from out of somewhere. They were not Harlem protesters. And actually the community took offense to that. If we're going to be torn up, it's not going to be someone coming from somewhere else tearing it up. And so there was a informal organizing of us on the phone. Thank God we have these type of systems already in place. And we had people that were reporting to each other. They're on their way here. They're almost up to 125th Street. And the eyes and ears went in, and infiltrators got in with the protesters to let them know that you're not going to tear up 125th Street. And so we were able to protect ourselves. What Dan was talking about, how they maneuvered, we noticed that they were using encryption and diversion tactics to run the police around the wrong way. But community residents were watching for us and calling the police and telling them what they saw going on. So we had one H&M was broken into, and looted, but that was not with the protests. We think that was someone taking advantage of it. So because of that, everyone did board up, like you said, Jessica. We were forced to, because then night after night, people kept coming and we had to keep that whole process going. And so my property owners did not want that look, because it took you back to what Harlem used to look like when we were boarded down. And that's when we started doing murals with people there. Now, the only thing that's still boarded up are things like the movie theaters, the cosmetic stores. People are trying to figure out how to open up with social distancing and keeping people safe.
So speaking of which, to that point, the governor and mayor announced today that indoor dining was not going to start July 6th. It could be weeks or months before that gets started. How big of an impact does that have in any of your districts?
Well, if it extends for a long period, I think the early predictions of how many restaurants would go out of business will be much worse. Because today, good example, last 2 days, Bryant Park, we have excellent outdoor eating there because we have gardens and movable seating outside all the food and beverage facilities. But badly timed thunderstorms at 12:30 both days knocked that out. So we're at the mercy of weather. So are the people doing this on Madison Avenue and 57th Street and elsewhere. No indoor dining, if it continues for a couple months, may be the last straw for a lot of these restaurants, which are very thin on profit margin anyway, and have some fixed costs.
And Jessica, I know you're more an office district than restaurants, but of course—
What? We got 1,200 bars, restaurants, and retail shops, Eric.
Okay.
I'll walk you around and give you a tour.
But how are they doing, given that almost no one is going to the office yet, or are they?
No, it's tough. It's tough, and I agree with Dan. I think this is a business that runs on very, very low margins to begin with, and for us, as a central business district, we have 62,000 residents. That's meaningful for certain restaurants in terms of weekend business, dinner business. But no, I mean, we need our hundreds and thousands of workers to be back in their offices. A big chunk of which, by the way, are government workers. So once the mayor starts to bring people back, and some companies are, McKinsey is, Goldman is, starting to, but others are not. Amex said that they weren't. So it's a real. It's been a really hard few months for them. They're feeling increasingly desperate and despondent. It took the city an awfully long time to even come up with rules to allow outdoor dining, which, I'm glad that they did, and we've been working with them, but it's not that complicated. And I think the program that's in place is at least easy for people to understand and apply. So I think it's going to be grim, and I think a lot of these restaurants won't survive, quite frankly. And as I said, what we're trying to do is help them with grants, help them with services and expertise to think through how they reconfigure their spaces, to think through how they improve quickly their ability to take orders online, to hold their hands, to help them think about how they can do outdoor dining. To try, because I think it's people are feeling really desperate.
Mm-hmm. Dan, what's it like in your area for dining right now, and office for that matter?
Well, I described Bryant Park. 34th Street doesn't have the number of restaurants Jessica mentioned. We've got our district, maybe 25 or 30. 9 or 10 of them are ideally set up to have outdoor dining, and some of them are already doing it. But as Jessica said, the office workers aren't back yet. For the most part, we hear discouraging things at both of our board meetings, Bryant Park and 34th Street in June. We did a straw poll of when business realty owners thought tenants would be back, and we heard a lot of discouraging talk about September or January. So, and then even worse, the tourists, and my metric on that is what languages I hear on 5th and 6th Avenues during the weekday, and then in Central Park on the weekend. It's all English now, all English. You don't hear French, you don't hear Italian, you don't hear Spanish, you don't hear Chinese. It's much different than it was last year at this time. This is the shoulder season for the tourist business, and it's not starting up.
Right. I'm assuming you all have hotels in your districts as well, who are probably, most of them closed still, I would imagine.
Well, this is a big concern and has not received enough attention from the press, Eric. Roughly 28 hotels in Midtown South Precinct are now devoted to homeless citizens who were moved out of shelters or parolees from Rikers Island and the like. So it's giving revenue to the hotels, but it's making Midtown a much less happy place than it was before. There are a lot of street conditions we've never seen in all our years of running the BIDs.
Like what kind of conditions in particular? Are people littering, people urinating on the corners? What?
The people that are on drugs quite conspicuously. Today I spent an hour on 35th Street between 5th and 6th, where the Kixby Hotel has become a refuge for people ex of the shelters. And when you're in the business, as long as I've been, you get to recognize what somebody on heroin looks like. And there were 7 people clearly on heroin stumbling around in that one block. It's partly in our district, partly in Barbara Blair's district to the north. So it's a challenge right now.
Mm-hmm. And Barbara, how are you doing up there on 125th Street?
So just going back to the hotels and the restaurants and offices, those were some of our challenges, and we never had been able to attract quality office tenants except for government. We didn't have many restaurants because we actually had a plan for to grow 125th Street to be the best that it could, and then those type things would go on the side street. And so, and again, I guess in the COVID environment, it's almost a blessing. Everywhere there's a problem, we didn't have those things. So we don't have offices that's closed. We don't have restaurants. And so the street is starting to come back. But in terms of the crime and the things that Dan is talking about, when we started our bid, that was our biggest problem. And so we've been working on it for a number of years, and we have the opposite problem of now oversaturation of community facilities to address those populations. So we now have people coming from other places for those services. That's creating pockets of things. And the thing that people don't realize about these services, and we need to talk about it more, is you have services for people who own drugs, but they don't get rid of the drug dealers. So then they leave and the drug dealers come out and say, I got the real stuff. So it increases more drug dealing. So it becomes more police, you know, a social service issue, and they're not working together. So we can move them, and we don't have the large numbers like Dan have in his district, because we've been working on it since 1993, and we have these relationships with these different facilities. But now we're just getting so many people coming as far away from Staten Island and then they don't go home. They just stay drugged out, like you said, nodded out till they wake up, and they go home the next day. So that's what's happening to us. Our biggest fight is Lenox Avenue between 124th and 126th Street. It's a major, major hotbed.
Now, Barbara, you and Dan, and I, for that matter, we remember, Jessica, you're a lot younger than we are, I feel, but we remember what they call the bad old days, which I think most of New York doesn't anymore. And we're nowhere near, correct, where we were in the 70s and 80s, right? It's just relative to what maybe we've gotten used to, that things look bad now. Or Dan, what's your perspective on that?
Well, the most valuable document you can get, and it's open to everybody, it's publicized on Friday morning, is the CompStat numbers for the New York City Police Department. It shows the tremendous progress since the 70s and now the backsliding in the first 6 months of this year. So we're heading probably for 450 or 500 murders versus the steady state of 300 that we had reached for the last 3 years. And that's disturbing. And even more disturbing is the number of shootings, which has been highly publicized by the media.
Right. Just for some perspective, the record high for murders is more than 2,200. Right. So if we end up at 500 this year, yeah, that would be terrible, because it would be a 60% increase from what we've seen the last few years. But it's not 2,200 either.
No, but the quality of life, I mean, you can feel it changing rapidly. You can feel it changing rapidly. And with everything that's happening with the police not knowing when and how to respond because their duties are evolving, plus budget cuts, till people don't see a police presence like they did before. So people are comfortable. Like I'm noticing the number of homeless encampments. That was always a big thing for me. You know, we had to make sure that we took them away. I'm noticing that that's growing. I'm noticing that the panhandling, when you stop at the red light, people coming up to the cars, that's growing. We're noticing that the homeless are comfortable enough to where they're having fights with each other out on the street. People don't see all of these things happening, but when they're there all the time, their life starts on the street. So it's not all the way back to the way it was, but the signs of it getting there is changing every day. Every day I notice an uptick. When I come into my office, instead of having one person sitting at my step that I have to ask to move, I now have 3 to 4. Each day it's becoming more and more.
Jessica, what's it like downtown?
I'm a little more optimistic. You know, I think it's going to be really hard going in the short term. And for the record, I was born in the 70s in the city. So I certainly do remember what it was like getting on graffiti-filled subway cars. You know, and the idea, like, you would never take the subway at 2 in the morning. The idea then pre-COVID, you'd get in a subway car at 4 in the morning and it would be completely packed. You know, sort of not the New York I grew up in. But I do think it will, you know, if things in terms of the disease sort of in New York's trend in the current pattern, you know, I think things will get better. And we're in for maybe a tough year or two. And, you know, the city revenue, the city budget, you know, was you know, it's all tough. But I don't know. I think the fundamentals here are much stronger than they were in the 70s, honestly. I think we're starting in a much better place.
Well, you know, after 9/11, when downtown was essentially rebuilt, there was a debate over whether it should be a pure office district or a mixed use kind of live, work, play district. Chuck Schumer was all for office. Other people were for live, work, play, Dan Doctoroff. And you went with live, work, play. So maybe you could just take sort of 30 seconds and tell us whether that has panned out or have people cleared out of town now that those who can afford to can.
It was 100% the right thing to do, and has made us a more very diverse district and will help us in our recovery much better. You know, just in terms of having 3 times as many people who live downtown today as we did on 9/11. As I said, that was supporting the essential businesses that were open. You know, those are people who have been kind of keeping the neighborhood going. And, you know, even just in terms of the mix of industries we have, it is a much more diverse group, or, you know, went from 55% financial services to 35% financial services. So, you know, I think it for sure, you know, there is always a tipping point in a central business district, but it was the right thing for us and will help us come out of this recovery more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Now, bids are somewhat controversial, believe it or not, business improvement districts, in that there's often a fight when someone tries to create a bid because there are folks who don't want to pay the extra taxes. And there are merchants who oppose bids because they fear that their rents will go up if a bid comes in and they don't need you guys. So I wondered, you know, and just a couple of your critics, there's a Columbia professor who called them cartels for landlords. And my former colleague, Aaron Elstein, called them landlord-controlled shadow governments. So I wonder if you could share your perspective on you know, that whole dynamic where the big landlords, you know, who are paying most of the assessments sort of call the shots and merchants don't. Dan, you want to start there, or Barbara?
Yeah, I'd like to start because I remember back when the academians and the newspapers wouldn't even write about us. And then I remember when they did start writing about us, you know, when we started becoming successful. And So there was a time when they didn't do the analyzing and the data collecting because we were just doing, making sure we kept the streets clean and safe. And so I've read a lot of what people say over the time, and I don't necessarily agree with it because I think looking in, you don't understand it from the role of a practitioner. And so I look at our value. I don't see it as though the landlords are dictating it, exactly what's going to happen. They have the majority vote, and they should, because whether you have a tenant or not, you still have to pay the assessment. And so when you include and have the merchants there to have a voice, like I separate merchants from landlords, and because landlords and their tenants have their own relationships. So we have a special group that look at all the needs of the merchants. We have a property owners, they all talk amongst themselves. That's real estate development and big picture items.
Mm-hmm.
Then we merge them together. So it comes around the operations, which is why I say, again, it comes down to, if you're not a practitioner, you're just looking at the data and drawing a conclusion like you always do as an academic.
Right. Dan, how do I'm sure you've dealt with this issue for years, but how do you navigate that?
Well, we had a different issue, Eric. When you started asking the question, I was thinking of my early 50 or so visits with people I wanted to support the creation of Bryant Park and Grand Central Partnership. And they would inevitably say what you said, which is, the city should be doing this. This is double taxation. So I'd say, sir, if you want to wait till, these people all reminded me of my grandfather. They were born in the Lower East Side, about the same time my grandfather was. So I felt comfortable with them. I'd say, sir, you are going to wait around a long time for the city to do outside your building what you want. That was my first answer. Second was, they'd say, it's going to be a big expense piled on. And I would say, well, let me tell you, I know what your real estate taxes are. I know what our assessment is. It's about 1.25% of what you're paying in real estate taxes. And if you want to fire Mayor Koch or Mayor Dinkins or Mayor Giuliani, you need to go to the city council and scream about how he should be fired and taken out of office. And that's
Right.
no effect at all. But if you want to fire me, if you're loud and long enough, you could get that done. So for 1.5%, I said, if Vornado calls up and says, Dan, you're out, I'm out. So 1.5% of the total cost, you have a lot more voice in your services. So they kind of dismissed my argument, they'd wait forever. But when I made that second argument, they kind of nod to me and say, well, it makes some sense. It gives me some power. So it was a hard pitch to make. We were the third and seventh BIDs, but the only big one was Grand Central in the 1980s. It covered a huge part of East Midtown.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica, what are the politics of the Downtown Alliance?
I mean, I think I have a very collaborative approach, and our board is quite large. There are 40 members of the board, half of whom are property owners, 5 of which are the elected officials or their reps, and the rest are tenants and residents. And I mean, we've made a concerted effort over the years to make sure that the board does reflect different industries, different geographic parts of the district, people who do live there. So, we've, and the community board chair is on our board, and we've always worked very closely together. That doesn't mean we're going to agree 100% of the time, any of us, on everything.
Right. Well, as Barbara mentioned, like not all board members vote though, correct?
Actually, on my board, they all do vote. The only ex officio is the community board chair. We have a separate residential rep who does vote. So, I mean, again, I think, all different bids are constructed in different ways and charge different assessments. And that's how ours is and has been. Again, there are sometimes tensions that arise, but for the most part, that's not how we've seen it play out. I think people honestly are grateful that we're there. We get asked to do things all the time that, when we can, which is 90% of the time, we say yes, and people appreciate that. So, I think to Dan's point, if even when times were good and the city was flush, they're just services they're not going to provide. I mean, they're just like, who would you call in the city to remove graffiti? I don't even know who you'd call, because they don't do it. And in fact, the police call us, people at City Hall call us. We're happy to do it. And I think, again, after the protests came through night after night and you saw the graffiti, you know, it just proved again, it's so important to get out there and be proactive and remove it and not let it linger. So, you know, I think, you know, there are always going to be people who complain and who look to try and create tension. But, you know, my experience has been, for the most part, people really appreciate what we do.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, tell me, go ahead, Dan, sorry.
No, I wasn't speaking.
Oh, sorry. So Barbara, 125th Street was rezoned during the Bloomberg administration, and that really changed, didn't it? Didn't it change the corridor? You could build bigger buildings. Maybe it brought in some property owners that, you know, hadn't been there before. I ask about this because I just wondered if you could share your perspective on how that's worked out, because suddenly rezonings are kind of looked on with suspicion by many in the community. Maybe they were then as well. But how has that worked out for you? You know, how's the flavor of 125th Street changed? I mean, we think of Harlem as a place that has really come up in the last 20 years.
Sure. Well, rezoning was looked at, frowned on at that time too, and it was really a grueling process. I mean, seriously grueling process, because it was on the tail end. They were rezoning for Columbia at the same time. So this rezoning brought the whole community together to all of the many meetings, night after night after night. But what came out of it was we came to a conclusion of a vision for 125th Street, which was to be an arts, cultural, and entertainment district. And that also brought in for taller buildings, as you said, but the community was so involved in it, they didn't want shadows over 125th Street. So we got this crazy rezoning where one side of the street can be a certain height, another one can go higher up. And as a result of that, we did get new development. As you know, right after the rezoning in 2008, they had the economic crisis, so it slowed everything down. But, and with COVID now, we actually have 3 projects that are in development, our first hotel, and we're getting more residential because that added the residential. We didn't have residential before, but now we do. So it helped in some areas, but the arts bonus that we put in does not work because the bonus was a 4-to-1 ratio, and most arts places need at least 2 floors. So no one saw that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't economically make sense to use it. So we're now looking to go back for a text amendment change. But government properties are using the arts bonus, but private is not. So that's the difference.
Mm-hmm. Jessica, you know, after 9/11, a lot of tax incentives were put in place to help downtown come back, and downtown came roaring back, but the tax incentives seem to linger even after you had made it. Are any of those still around?
They are, and they're not just for Lower Manhattan. I would sort of remind viewers that they're also for you know, sort of north of 96th Street and the other boroughs as well. Some of them. Yes, we have come roaring back, and my job in part is to tout our success. But I also remind people that we're not done. Meaning, you know, we still have 2 buildings left to build at the World Trade Center site. And now, you know, there's going to be, you know, probably even a longer delay in terms of Tower 2, and you have Site 5, where there's been a discussion and debate as to whether that should be residential or commercial. It's the old Deutsche Bank building site, Site 5. So we have come a really long way, and leasing has gone very well in 3 World Trade Center, but you know, we're not finished. And clearly, you know, I'm grateful that they were renewed before the pandemic really kind of took hold, because it's going to be a challenge in terms of commercial office leasing. You know, I'm more positive. I don't think people are going to work from home forever. I really don't. I just think that human nature and collaboration and why people are drawn to cities, that still holds.
Right.
And are we going to work more from home? Probably. Are things going to be exactly as they were? No. But I don't think the office era is over by any means. But I do think people in the shorter term are going to be much more hesitant and be rethinking some of their needs. So, you know, for an area like ours, that's had its challenges. We're really grateful that the state renewed them and that the governor signed off on that.
Dan, does it bother you or the office owners in your area that one part of the city, one office district, has some advantages given to it by government that others don't? And this is kind of relevant to Barbara as well, because Harlem is actually connected to Hudson Yards through some interesting gerrymandering that enabled Hudson Yards to get some tax benefits that were originally intended for Harlem. But let me put the question to you, Dan, first. Like, do you have a problem with the uneven playing field that government creates with some of these incentive programs?
I haven't heard that from most of my owners. And in fact, I think Bank of America Tower at 4, 2, and 6 somehow benefited, as I recall, from some of those same incentives, and I forget how. So there was recognition that Lower Manhattan had to be brought back. And I noticed they'd say we can't compete with highly subsidized buildings, but it wasn't the source of a lot of complaining. And I certainly wasn't out there complaining about it.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, did that issue come up at all where, there were some stories about how, this employment zone had been created connecting Harlem to Hudson Yards, and Hudson Yards is one of the most, high end, it was the largest private development in the country. And here they were getting these benefits.
No, because I think, and this is just a guess, is because we had the empowerment zone. And because we had the empowerment zone with incentives, which was a whole lot of incentives to attract people to Harlem. And it wasn't just for developers, it was also to increase the hiring of community residents, which was a big problem for us. So we had a lot of incentives on the table. I mean, it was recognized, but it was recognized as something that happens, just like, the cutoff for, congestion parking is 96th Street, and then what are we going to do here in Harlem? It's something that happens and we talk about all the time, but we didn't see it as detrimental to the development because we did have that empowerment zone working.
So Dan, we only have about 5 minutes left. I'd be remiss if I did not ask you about your favorite topic, which is street vendors. I know you've been at war with the street vending for, it seems like, decades, and no bill was ever passed. But have you changed your view at all now that you can't really go inside and order food anymore, that maybe it's an advantage to have this outdoor food option?
No, not really. At Bryant Park, we really decided to stop fighting the food vendors we had and start working with them. We got to know them all. They varied interestingly, and eventually we made agreements that just by the end of 2019, that they would have more attractive carts. So that was really pleasant. And then that was about to go down. Many of them owned carts illegally down at 34th Street, and we were going to work with them down there on the same kinds of improvements. So that was moving along, and I was telling my 34th Street board, you'll be pleasantly surprised that we can get some of these guys to do the right thing without the intervention of the police department. But the backing of the police department to control people who were doing irresponsible food or general merchandise vending was important. And then we were the carrot and the police department was the stick. The street vending battle was lost 10 days ago forever when the mayor took the police department out of vending control. So if you look in Midtown districts now, you see perfume and toy vendors and the like that you haven't seen except on Sundays when there are no rules for arcane reasons. You haven't seen this in decades. It's a very bad look, and I don't have much hope for that. It's
who does enforcement? Who's supposed to enforce now, if not the police?
Hasn't been decided yet. We just asked the Consumer Affairs Department if they're going to take it over, but the police are out of it, so that battle is lost. We're going to have to. I don't think there's any way to work with the general merchandise vendors the way we've been working with the food vendors at Bryant Park. So I'm pessimistic there. I'm usually the optimist on everything. That's why I'm in this business. But on a couple of things you asked, I'm a pessimist, and this is one of them.
Well, Jessica, you're an optimist, as you mentioned.
I'm with Dan, though, on this one. I think, unfortunately, there's a reason why we have the vendors. It's, been part of our culture and history in New York City for hundreds of years. So, you know, I'm not anti-vendor, but there are people who play by the rules and there are people who don't. And, you know, without any enforcement, and there will be, I mean, come on, even if Consumer Affairs says they're going to do it, they're not really equipped to do that kind of enforcement. So, you know, I think it's a real shame. And I think it's, you know, it's a disservice to the people who have been good actors. And, you know, if our streets are even further cluttered, you know, we're trying to maintain social distancing. I can just speak, you know, in Lower Manhattan, our sidewalks are pretty narrow to begin with. And so if you have sidewalks that are fewer than 6 feet wide, and now you're going to have a proliferation of vendors in that space, where are we supposed to walk safely? So I'm concerned, and I am sort of pessimistic about it, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Final question. Jessica, you were in the city council. If I remember correctly, you ran for Manhattan Borough President as well. Is that right?
I did in 2013.
So have you thought about getting back into elected office? Is that something you might consider in the future?
I am not running for office in 2021. I see that the ground is shifting. I saw today Maya Wiley said she was thinking about running for mayor, but I really enjoy what I'm doing. I think it's going to be an even more meaningful time to do the sort of work that we all do in terms of our neighborhoods and managing our public spaces. And I'm really looking forward to doing it.
Well, we're going to have to leave it on that note. Barbara Askins from the 125th Street Bid, Jessica Lappin from the Downtown Alliance, and Dan Biederman from the 34th Street Partnership et al. Thank you very much for joining us. And just a note to our viewers, I will be back here Monday at 5 o'clock. We'll be talking to 2 or 3 members of the City Council, so please tune in for that. If you have not subscribed to The Real Deal, go to therealdeal.com and subscribe, and we will see you next time on TRD Talks Live. Thanks, everyone.
Good job, Aaron.
Goodbye.